Our scripture reading today is from 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12. I'm going to abbreviate quite a bit of this and offer some commentary along the way. So I'm not reading the whole thing, just so you know, but I do encourage you to read this on your own at some point. Starting at chapter 11. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Elam and wife of Uriah the Hittite." So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people fared and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king to make his homecoming all the more wonderful. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the army, with the servants of the army of the Lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David, Uriah did not go down to his house. David said to Uriah, "You have just come from a journey. Why did you not go down to your house?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah remain in booths and tents out in the desert. And my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to Uriah, "Remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence and made him drunk, trying again to get him to go visit his wife. And in the evening, he went out to lie on the couch with the servants and soldiers, but did not go to his house. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter, he summarized a way for Joab to move Uriah to the front lines and then abandon him in battle so that he would be killed. Since all of David's attempts thus far to cover up the fact that he's actually the father of Bathsheba's child and not be able to pass it off on Uriah have failed. So he is resorting now to contriving the battle to specifically kill Uriah, and sends Uriah with the letter that delivers this message. Uriah ends up being killed, and Joab sends the message back to David. When the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, she made lamentation for him. When the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord, and the Lord sent Nathan to David. This is when Nathan comes and tells the parable that Felipe recounted this morning with the children. And it's only at this point that David finally realizes that he has done anything that's worth reprimand or that has any consequences. At the end of the parable, David's anger was greatly kindled against the man in the parable. He said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did such a thing, and because he has no pity." Nathan said to David, "You are the man." At this point, he realizes that what he has done, God is not pleased with, and there may be some consequences from that. Nathan outlines them in great detail, and even includes that the child that's just been born to David and Bathsheba will die as a consequence. We close chapter 12 with the birth and death of David and Bathsheba's first son. And then David consoled his wife, Bathsheba, and went to her and lay with her. And she bore a son and named him Solomon. The Lord loved him and sent a message to the prophet Nathan, so he named him Jedediah because of the Lord. This is the word of the Lord for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Please pray with me. Holy One, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. In 2006, Black activist Tarnia Burke started the Me Too movement as an initiative to unite survivors of sexual violence. Just 1 year ago last week, the hashtag took on new life when actor Alyssa Milano highlighted it. On October 17th of last year, only 2 days after the hashtag caught fire, nearly half of the people in the United States were friends with someone who had posted Me Too, according to Facebook. Before she walked the red carpet at the 2017 Oscars, along with other activists who attended as plus ones of their celebrity allies, Burke said, "If we keep on making statements and not really doing the work, we are going to be in trouble." The Twitter campaigns have indicated the sort of conversations we need to be having, but the words don't do the work by themselves. The next question is, how do we as a global community expand this conversation? Part of where we need to expand this conversation and where we are uniquely responsible is in the church. And where do we start in the life of the church but with Scripture itself? In the era of Me Too, Time's Up, Believe Women, and the Women's March campaigns, breathing new life into a broader women's rights movement, we need to look at how biblical women would resonate with these concepts and have plenty of their own stories to share. Although these stories are always challenging and often tragic, they are stories of women of our faith that we too seldom hear. Their names and stories are like tiny veins of gold running through Scripture that we must mine for all their worth, which is a lot more than the worth they've been assigned throughout history. Admittedly, the Bible, which was primarily written and edited by men, doesn't give us much to go on, but we need to pay attention to every little bit they give us. And if we responsibly put together what Scripture actually offers us with what we know about the lives of people, and in particular women, throughout history and in biblical times, Scripture can reveal much more about God than we ever imagined, and perhaps some very different things about God than we imagined. We are doing a disservice to our ancestors, to ourselves, and most of all to God by not hearing the stories that are between the lines of Scripture. When encountering these narratives again in 2018, we must ask ourselves, who has power over whom in the story? From whose point of view is the story being told? How would the story be different if told from another viewpoint? And perhaps most important, why was the story included in Scripture? And what does the story offer, if any? Does it offer hope? Christine Blasey Ford said that before coming forward with her report of assault by Brett Kavanaugh, that she was, quote, calculating the daily risk benefit for me of coming forward and wondering whether I would just be jumping in front of a train that was headed to where it was headed anyway. If the feeling of coming forward to report assault by a man in power in the 21st century, when we as women are legally allowed to vote and own property, is akin to jumping in front of a moving train, what must it have been like for women in ancient times, for our sisters of the faith? We live in an era of material women's rights, but not ideological ones, as the Me Too, Time's Up, and Women's March campaigns have shown. Looking honestly at the story of Bathsheba and David lets us see how far we've come, how far we have to go, and what God has to say about it. Women's stories matter, and Bathsheba is no exception. So holding those questions in our own context in our hearts, let's look anew at the story of Bathsheba and David. Part of what I want to do this morning is deconstruct thousands of years of history, no big deal there, to reveal inaccuracies in our perception of the text, because those interpretations that we've inherited and seep into our culture, even popular culture, have consistently discounted the realities of women during that time and place in their society. Bathsheba's story, like Eve's and so many others, have been hijacked to serve the interest of patriarchal power structures that are then used to blame women for everything bad that happens and everything bad that happens to men that dare get too close to one, let alone listen to them, talk, or trust them. These women of faith deserve to have their stories told in a way that they themselves would have recognized. And when we aren't sure of what that would be, it's okay to just leave it a question. About Bathsheba, I would like us to ponder a few more specific questions. Could Bathsheba have said no when David summoned her? Could she have protested the assault once in the palace? Would she have wanted to or considered the risk? How did she feel about David's attention? How did she feel when David casually had her husband Uriah murdered? How did she feel about being forced to remarry so soon after mourning? How did the birth of Solomon change the situation after the death of her first child? We'll never know the exact answers to these questions, but to even begin imagining what Bathsheba herself might have to say in response, we need to be honest about the power imbalance between David and Bathsheba, between men and women, remembering that women had little to no agency as independent people during that time, and in fact through most of history, and this is still a reality for women around the world. This is what patriarchy looks like in action, Ruth Everhart explains in her article, The Bible's Me Too Stories. I'll say it again. This is what patriarchy looks like in action when women have no good options despite their best efforts. Women were recognized only by their relationships to men as daughters, wives, mothers, sisters. Does any of this sound familiar? Or perhaps you've seen it in some Facebook memes and Twitters and tweets on Twitter. This is the way that Bathsheba is introduced to us and to David as Bathsheba, daughter of Elam, wife of Uriah the Hittite, almost as a warning to David that she is someone. She's the daughter of a man worth knowing the name of, and she's the wife of a man worth knowing the name of, one of David's own loyal commanders. But even though Bathsheba has every protection the times could offer a woman of her station, it's not enough to keep her safe from David and from him upending her entire life. In her article, Listening to Tamar, Paying Attention to the Verbs and Who Controls Them, Anna Carter Florence notes, this is what the prophets warned about when Israel started wheedling them for a king. Kings, they cautioned, are dangerous. Even a king as golden and righteous as David is dangerous. Kings succumb to the temptation of their own power, and eventually they overstep. They take what doesn't belong to them. And sure enough, that's what David does. David had 8 wives, 8 named wives, and 10 identified concubines. He took many more unidentified wives and unidentified concubines during his 33-year reign in Jerusalem. All of his wives so far that we know of anything about were taken in marriage because they strategically benefited David or another man in some way. Bathsheba is the first wife David takes after his move to Jerusalem, as David struggles to figure out what to do with all the power he has. The fact that when the king wants something, he gets it is no secret to anyone. David is known for his military conquests and warring nature. Repeatedly in David's stories and others, military conquest and sexual conquests are linked. David's life is rife with it, and it doesn't stop with him. Following the account of David and Bathsheba's relationship, the editors of Scripture immediately follow that in chapter 13 with the story of the rape of Tamar, David's daughter, by her half-brother Amnon. Tamar's own speech as she advocates for herself reminds us, according to biblical law, that all Amnon would have to do to make his act not count as rape was to marry her first. Actual consent wasn't even on the table as a concept in Tamar's life, nor in Bathsheba's when it came to David. When we look back at the story of Bathsheba and David, with the lens Tamar gives us, we can see more clearly just what the women of their day were up against, even when they were as righteous, doing everything they were supposed to do as righteous Jewish women. Bathsheba herself was a well-off woman, while perhaps without a formal education. She would have been wise to what her options were when it came to David's summons, and I'm sure she would have weighed carefully the different price she would have paid for each of her decisions. She would have been wise to the risks that other biblical women clue us into, like Queen Vashti, who is sentenced to death for simply refusing to come downstairs to her drunk and rowdy husband to be shown off and paraded as entertainment before his friends. Esther was her replacement, if you don't recognize Queen Vashti's name. So Esther is her replacement. That's another typical romantic princess story, right? That's what we learned as I was growing up. It absolutely isn't, and neither is David and Bathsheba. These women deserve better after thousands of years of having their stories told for them. For us to consider, perhaps for the first time, what the story would have sounded like had they got to tell it. Had they ever gotten to the chance to star in their own narrative instead of being a pawn in someone else's. When we continue to tell biblical stories in ways that whitewash violence as romance, we will continue to tell modern stories this way. And we will continue to define God by artificial values we've placed on masculine and feminine traits, which harms LGBTQIA+ folks and cisgendered women and men alike. Our own unintentional, ingrained misogyny creeps into our faith in subtle ways. Preferring masculine pronouns for the name of God, because the name doesn't really matter, I just like it better and it just comes out. Or continuing to base our criteria for leaders on men like David, who turn out to be just what the prophets warned the people of. Or the fact that it takes female clergy on average years longer to receive their first call than their male colleagues, and on average still getting paid less when they do receive one. Or having to wait until 2018 to find Sunday school curriculum for the children with more than one healthy, accurate story about a woman. And I specifically challenge you, I'm sure you can think of others, I challenge you to do so prayerfully. It's annoying and empowering once you get in the habit, so you're welcome to join that fun club with me. We're making progress, friends. We're getting closer to recognizing what God really means by shalom. How we can make peace and offer wholeness to all of God's beloved children through our interactions with each other. We're making progress as we've seen millions of women and allies take to the streets, lifting up various causes to amplify each other's voices so that maybe, finally, we'll start to hear each other and ourselves. We're making progress because there are more women running for local, state, and national offices this year than ever before. We're making progress in colleges, starting to shift how they deal with sexual assault, and a fraternity at Emory University recently held an event for its members sponsored by Men Stopping Violence, which among other things, they discussed the definition of consent. From Weinstein to Cosby, the entertainment industry is beginning to make progress in extricating itself from the long history of brushing rape, assault, and misconduct under the rug when profits are at stake. We're collecting reliable data to improve the lives of women, and we're learning things like every one additional year of education for women of reproductive age decreases child mortality by almost 10%. And when women around the world have an income, they are more likely to spend a higher percentage of it on their children and household welfare than men earning the same income. And we also get to celebrate progress by seeing our own Anne McLaren receive the Spark Award from the Society of Women Engineers, which honors an individual who has contributed to the advancement of women by mentoring women around her. Bit by bit, we're heeding God as she continues to breathe life into old texts and old stories we thought we knew. In the era of Me Too, Time's Up, Believe Women, and the Women's March campaigns, we can take new strength and courage from hearing the voices of women in the Bible whose stories were stolen and silenced, and in spite of it all, they managed to change history. God never abandoned them, even if the authors did. And as one of the 4 women named in Jesus' lineage, the impact Bathsheba had is something the writers and editors did want us to know, even if they didn't go into great detail. Our God, who created everything good, created every human person good, equally deserving of love and safety and trust, that God manages to work miracles and make great things happen from the worst of our decisions and pain, even when we fight her at every turn and take our anger out on those around us. It's up to us to make that vision of shalom a reality, and we have to make that choice every day to pursue that vision, to build that kingdom where we can finally see each other the way God sees us, so that all of us can enjoy God's shalom in true peace and wholeness, regardless of class, race, gender, or creed. That's the story of Bathsheba, daughter of Elam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, mother of King Solomon, ancestor to Jesus, beloved child of God. That is the story of Bathsheba, beloved child of God.